because of the circumstances, we are going to go with Governor Weld first. He is going to be speaking here and taking questions for about a half hour. And then we will, I will have to play the bad guy and make decisions about who can speak, how long they can speak afterwards in the next following half hour. And then we will make a decision about opening the business session of the convention. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome the former governor of Massachusetts and candidate for governor of New York in this year of 2006, William Weld.
Thank you so much, John, and it's a delight for me to be here. As I was mentioning to some of you earlier, I've been a self-described libertarian since probably before the day I was elected back in 1990. So this is the first libertarian convention that I've appeared at, however, since Massachusetts had just the two parties. It had some of the same dynamic in that independent voters could cross over and vote in either the Republican or Democratic primaries, so the vote totals in those primaries tended to fluctuate wildly from year to year depending on who was the most interesting candidate to the independents. But New York obviously is a totally different kettle of fish, and this is my first baby step in attempting to navigate, but I feel very comfortable in these surroundings. I wanted to deliver a few somewhat formal remarks to capture some of my thinking about how libertarian principles apply to the duties of the next governor. I don't know that I'll have the eloquence of my fellow graduate, Mr. Silberger, but I hope to convey some of what I have in mind, and then, as John said, very happy to do questions and answers. In terms of my political philosophy, I would say that proper governance can be summed up in the phrase, keep out of my pocketbook and keep out of my bedroom, to the government. And when the government leaves citizens alone, it empowers them, and without that undue government interference, we retain unlimited possibilities that come through choice and competition. And obviously, I think we agree, it's the individual who can best decide how that person can spend his money, and the family that can best decide what's best for their children. I was a great reader of John Stuart Mill in my college days and on liberty, and he pointed out the worth of the state in the long run is the worth of the individuals composing it. And that's why it's important to preserve freedoms and empower individuals. New York, I think, has done a reasonable job of staying out of our bedrooms. Most political figures here respect a woman's right to choose. Government seems to have a little bit harder time keeping its mitts out of our wallets, however. Politicians in this state have continued to turn government into a kind of grocery store that offers never-ending goodies to voters, and they forget that it's the voters who ultimately have to pay for these things through a loss of liberty and a loss of resources. And by taking liberty from the individual, in my view, we weaken the state. New York is spending way too much. That's the root cause of a lot of our difficulties. Our Medicaid program is more expensive than California, although its program covers 55% more people than ours. Last year, the budget here was bigger than Florida and Texas combined. And if we had a Medicaid program that was twice the national average, instead of more, we'd be saving $5.3 billion a year. And how does the state feed this out-of-control spending? By taxes, by New York taxes. This is now the most highly taxed state in the country, if you include county and local taxes. That was a dubious distinction that belonged to Massachusetts when I took it over in the early 90s. We were recently ranked the worst business tax climate out of 50 states in the country. And when we're not taxing, we're borrowing. There was a very recent report by the Citizens Budget Commission that revealed that our state and local governments and public authorities have borrowed $227 billion. And then when you run out of money from taxes and borrowing, you've got other creative schemes such as the kilo approach to raising money, of which more later. I think we're now seeing the effects of that misguided fiscal policy. New Yorkers are leaving. They're leaving in droves. We're losing a lot of our talented young people. We lost, between 2000 and 2005, 1 million people. We're number one among the 50 states in terms of out-migration of population. other states are competing successfully for our people. You probably know Florida and Texas have no state income tax, and a number of other southern and western states have significantly lower property taxes. That's relevant. Now, in terms of what I'm going to do, I do think there's some things we can do to keep the government out of our pocketbook. Number one, we can send government to bed without its supper. In other words, cut taxes. Some of you may know Proudhon, the French anarchist, said that property is theft. How about taxation is theft? It's organized theft, to be sure, but theft all the same. And if we truly want to create jobs and help families and individuals, I've suggested we could do worse than to eliminate all income taxes for people earning under $75,000 a year. I think it'd be handy to consider eliminating taxes for this demographic, because our tax burden is effectively robbing those people of the power of choice, at least to some degree. If you're a family earning $40,000 or $50,000, you may not have, as a practical matter, a choice of where to send your children to school. You may not have a choice even as to whether to buy health insurance. I also want to create an incentive for people to stay in New York. Living here, given our natural resources, it's a spectacularly beautiful state, as you all know. Living here should be a very attractive choice, but if you're earning well under that $75,000 a year, a place like Florida with no income tax could seem to be a little bit more attractive. I also plan to build on my prior experience to put in a provision to limit property tax increases to 2.5%, property tax as a whole to 2.5% of total valuation, and limit growth in that tax to no more than 2.5% a year. Massachusetts had that provision since 1980, the year that Ronald Reagan was elected, and it worked very well in terms of avoiding spikes in the property tax, so it didn't go up 16, 20, 25% a year, which you do get in New York counties. Number two, Roman numeral 2, I think we can put a leash and a collar on government spending. I proposed a taxpayer's Bill of Rights that would limit government spending in this state to the previous year's revenues, with suitable adjustments for population growth and inflation. We don't really have to worry about that figure going up because of population growth in New York, since we're losing people. But you give the government credit for inflation. Colorado had this provision for the last decade, and it worked very well in terms of stimulating their economy. It didn't have the safety valve that I had proposed. If there's a surplus over last year's revenues, then I proposed half of that would go back to the taxpayers through a rebate, and the other half would go into a rainy day fund. So you'd build that up against the lean years, which will inevitably return. Also, I do think we need to pay some attention to foreclosing improper government methods to increase the tax base, and that's the reference to Kelo. There are, to be sure, under the Fifth Amendment, proper exercises of eminent domain. Takings for public infrastructure, that's a proper use. It's unfortunate, I think, that the Supreme Court Kelo decision seems to permit the government to use eminent domain solely to increase a government's tax base. And this, I believe, is fundamentally improper. While the government does have the power to tax under our Constitution, it does not exist to tax. Taxing, and the root criticism I have of the Kelo decision is this: taxation is not and should never be in itself a public use or a public purpose under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. So if I ran a zoo, that opinion would have recognized that the state has no inherent right to increase tax revenue. The citizens and the Constitution limit that function, and as I've often said, this is one of my slogans in public life, there's, in the final analysis, no such thing as government money. There's only taxpayers' money. So taxes and spending are the most important facet of improper government intrusion. They're not the only one. Regulation is right up there. New York businesses, small employers, suffer from job-killing costs. In addition to Medicaid, you've got very high energy costs here, workers' comp, tort costs, and excessive regulation kills jobs and limits freedom and stifles choice just as much as excessive taxation. I doubt everybody in this room would agree on every position, but I do hope that everyone here agrees with the fundamental principles of freedom and choice and competition. I'm an aficionado, even a disciple of Friedrich Hayek, the economist, and I do believe that a government that does respect individual rights is a government that best represents the spirit of American democracy. And removing the burdens of taxation and reducing the cost of doing business empower our individuals as well as our economy. And this will lead to good-paying jobs rather than to an expansive government program that decides what's best for New Yorkers. To remind everybody, in the words of one of my favorite philosophers, Robert Nozick, there are only individual people, different individual people with their own individual lives. Using one of these people for the benefit of others uses him and benefits the others, nothing more. So I think it's time to empower individuals through individual choice and competition. I do think we'll grow as a state and prosper, and I do think it's time, and I think it's possible, to make New York an example of proper governance, of freedom and choice and limited government. Stakes are pretty high. These issues run deep. Let me quote to close John Stuart Mill once more. A state which dwarfs its men in order that they may be made more docile instruments in its hands, even for beneficial purposes, will find that with small men, no great thing can really be accomplished. Thank you.
Questions? Well, I guess everybody.
Sure.
Yeah. Would you be willing to acknowledge that the war on drugs is bad and that the government should not be pursuing it?
Well, you know, I was a federal prosecutor for 7 years, so I think how drugs are approached really depends on the facts. And I know there's a big issue right now with the Rockefeller drug laws, and some people say that kids are being sent away for 10, 15 years for essentially possessory offenses, self-regarding conduct, if you will, in John Stuart Mill's phrase. I've checked in with some of the people in the state criminal justice system. They deny that as a factual matter. They say anybody who's getting hard time is purveying an awful lot of narcotics to an awful lot of other people on a commercial basis. So there's no way that could be viewed as self-regarding conduct. So, you know, I'm happy to continue to review that as a factual matter in deciding what approach to take to those existing laws in this state. But unless the critics are proved right as a factual matter, I probably would not go there. I have said in the past that in terms of medicinal marijuana, which I know is a much smaller issue, that I think that should be licensed by the FDA and the NIH like any other drug. If you take morphine now in the hospital, that's essentially opium, but it's licensed by the FDA and the NIH. So I wouldn't treat those drugs differently from each other. Ma'am.
You said it would be an FDA issue. If a bill were presented to you, would you sign a bill for New York to allow medical marijuana like 11 other states?
Well, you mean without the FDA and the NIH? No, I don't think you can really do that. You mean people to self-diagnose, I need marijuana for...
Like California, Vermont, Rhode Island have done?
If there's no reference to any medical or licensing authority and it's totally within the discretion of the individual to self-prescribe, as it were, I think...
Restrictive paradigms in each state has their own method for the procedure.
Well, without a restrictive paradigm, no. I don't know what the restrictive paradigms are in those states.
Yeah, there was a letter that was posted on the internet last night from 5 Republican Party chairmen of small counties, basically threatening you that you will be eliminated from the record of Republican Party if you go ahead with the Libertarian Party nomination. It said that you are doing terrible things, that you will break up and destroy the Republican Party. You will be. Have you read the letter, number one?
I did read it. It said the consequences of me seeking and accepting the Libertarian Party nomination for governor would be unimaginable. You didn't know you were so powerful.
Most of the people in this room haven't read the letter yet, so I'm hoping that somebody will distribute it. But my question to you, when I'm concerned about this letter, is that it has happened in the past that we have nominated a Republican candidate for governor, and he has chickened out and withdrawn, especially Howard Stern, and I believe this happened 2 or 3 times, where our candidate has withdrawn after being nominated. I want to make sure that you are going to stick to this to the end, no matter what threats you get from the Republican Party. And by the way, will you run even if you don't get the Republican Party nomination?
Yes and yes, and I'm sure you could infer that those 5 small county chairmen are not supporting me for the Republican nomination.
New York State has some of the worst gun laws in the country. It's just about impossible to get a carry permit. Governor Pataki signed some gun control legislation. I thought it was unfortunate and kind of a betrayal to the gun rights community that supported him his first time around. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on how the gun rights situation in New York could be improved.
Well, I'm a hunter and a gun owner, and consider myself a good Second Amendment man. I've been talking with the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, Tom King, and others, and my understanding is that while New York is supposed to be a shall-issue state, it's really not, that there's too much discretion and too much variety at the local level. And I'd be happy to do whatever is necessary to make New York really, truly a shall-issue state with respect to permits, which on paper it's supposed to be. Yes?
Well, should you be nominated by the Republican and Libertarian parties in order for your votes to be combined, that it would have to be a single lieutenant governor candidate, same person nominated by both of those parties? That person would probably be a Republican. Who would you be supporting for that position, or who do you see being nominated by the Republican Party?
Well, I think it's something I'm going to have to give a lot of thought to between now and June 1st, because governor and lieutenant governor in the Republican line, all parties, I guess, do run together. Certainly, I've given some thought to it. I think, you know, of relevance for your purposes, would I circle back with Mr. Clifton, Mr. Cooper, Ms. Capozzi, Chris Garvey, and others? Yeah, to talk about that situation. Yeah, I don't want to necessarily fracture what I hope will be a good thing. I think it's unlikely, given my political philosophy, that I'd be trying to run with someone on the Republican line who would be against everything that this party stands for.
Well, former Senator Hoffman has announced for that nomination. Is she someone who is acceptable to you?
You know, I don't think I should talk about individual candidates. She's got a pretty good Second Amendment record, and she knows a lot about farms. Those are 2 good things.
You said you would place a limit on spending as governor. The current governor has sought to, by line item vetoes, to limit spending. The legislature overrode his vetoes. The problem with the legislature, which is by some assessments a dysfunctional legislature, is that it continues to spend under every circumstance. What would you do as governor to deal with the legislature and its out-of-control spending habits?
Well, you know, I try to get this constitutional provision like they have in Colorado, which technically limits the legislature to no more than last year's revenues. And the reason I say constitutional is because one legislature cannot bind a future legislature, but a constitutional provision can. And just to give you ballpark, 2.8%. So maybe that would be a bigger diminution, 10%. And you know, take a while to get there. But, you know, I intend in offering these things that they would operate as constraints. Failing that, I suppose the governor could do worse than to submit a budget no greater than the prior year's revenues adjusted for population and inflation.